The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the small town. Jason Statham had spent most of his day relaxing at home, enjoying some rare downtime away from the chaos of Hollywood. He wasn't one for lounging around too much, though. He preferred staying active. So he decided to head out to the local grocery store to pick up a few essentials. It was just another ordinary errand on what seemed like an uneventful afternoon. As Jason walked through the sliding glass doors of the store, he took in the familiar sights and sounds. The hum of fluorescent lights, the faint beeping of scanners at the checkout counters, and the soft chatter of shoppers going about their routines. The air smelled faintly of fresh produce and baked goods. He grabbed a cart and began browsing the aisles, casually tossing items into it as he went. At first glance, everything appeared normal. Families strolled by with their carts filled to the brim. Elderly couples examined fruits together, and kids tugged at their parents' sleeves, begging for candy. But then, something caught Jason's attention. A murmur of raised voices coming from the front of the store. Curious, he paused mid-step, his sharp eyes scanning the area ahead. Near the checkout lines, a young woman stood gripping the handle of her shopping cart tightly. Her face was flushed, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a wad of coupons. Beside her were two wide-eyed children, clinging to her legs and looking frightened. Opposite her stood a burly man with crossed arms and a smug grin plastered across his face. His voice carried loudly over the din of the store as he accused her of cutting in line, despite the fact that she clearly hadn't moved from her spot. Jason frowned. He hated bullies. Whether it was during his childhood growing up in tough neighborhoods or later in life when he encountered arrogance on film sets, he'd always had zero tolerance for people who preyed on others' weaknesses. Something about this situation felt particularly unsettling. This wasn't just any shopper being rude. It was a mother trying to provide for her family, while facing aggression she didn't deserve. He lingered near the cereal aisle, pretending to compare boxes of oatmeal, but his focus remained fixed on the scene unfolding before him. Other customers glanced nervously at the confrontation, whispering among themselves. Some even backed away entirely, avoiding eye contact altogether. No one dared step forward to help. The tension grew thicker as the man continued berating the woman. "You think you're special because you've got kids," he sneered, his tone dripping with mockery. "Maybe next time, don't waste everyone's time with those stupid coupons." His words echoed harshly through the store, causing more heads to turn. A few people shook their heads disapprovingly, but still did nothing. Jason sighed inwardly. He'd hoped someone else might intervene, someone closer to the situation, but the longer he watched, the clearer it became that no one would. The woman looked overwhelmed, tears welling up in her eyes as she tried to explain herself. Her younger child started crying softly, tugging at her sleeve and asking why the man was yelling. For a moment, Jason considered walking away. After all, he valued his privacy and didn't want to draw unnecessary attention to himself. But deep down, he knew he couldn't ignore this. Not when he saw fear in the eyes of a mother trying to protect her children. Not when cowardice was winning. Standing there amidst the rows of cereal boxes, Jason made up his mind. Whatever happened next, he wouldn't let these bullies win. Not today. As Jason stood there, weighing his options, the situation took a turn for the worse. The burly man wasn't alone. Two of his friends appeared seemingly out of nowhere, joining him in ganging up on the young mother. They laughed and jeered, their voices loud enough to draw even more attention from nearby shoppers. One of them leaned casually against a shopping cart, smirking as he chimed in with sarcastic remarks. "Yeah, maybe she thinks her coupons make her better than us," he said mockingly, earning a round of chuckles from his companions. The woman's face turned pale as she realized she was now outnumbered. She tried to stay calm, clutching her purse tightly while keeping her children close behind her. Her voice trembled as she explained once again that she hadn't cut the line, but her words fell on deaf ears. Instead of backing down, the group only grew bolder. Their laughter became louder, their comments sharper. "Come on, lady," one of them taunted. Why don't you just pay full price like everyone else? Jason's jaw tightened as he watched the scene unfold. He could see the fear building in the woman's eyes, the way her shoulders slumped under the weight of their ridicule. Her younger child buried his face into her leg, whimpering softly, while her older daughter stared at the ground, clearly embarrassed and scared. It was a heartbreaking sight, one that made Jason's blood boil. These weren't just rude strangers. They were bullies preying on someone who couldn't fight back. Things escalated further when one of the men stepped closer to the woman, towering over her intimidatingly. "You know what?" he said, leaning down so his face was inches from hers. "If you can't afford your groceries, maybe you shouldn't have kids." His cruel words hit like a punch, silencing the surrounding chatter in the store. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Even the cashiers stopped scanning items, glancing nervously at the unfolding drama. The room felt heavy with tension. Some customers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact or pretending to be absorbed in their shopping lists. A few muttered disapproving comments under their breath, but no one dared to step forward. The fear of confrontation, or perhaps the fear of becoming a target themselves, kept them rooted in place. Jason noticed how the mother flinched at the man's proximity, her hands shaking as she tried to shield her children from the verbal assault. It wasn't just the insults that bothered Jason, it was the sheer unfairness of it all. Here was a single mother, doing her best to provide for her family, being attacked by people who had nothing better to do than tear others down. And yet, no one was standing up for her. No one except, well, maybe him. The thought crossed his mind again. Should he intervene? Was it really his place? He didn't want to cause a scene or risk escalating things further. But deep down, he knew he couldn't walk away. Every fiber of his being screamed that this wasn't right. Bullies thrived on silence, on the absence of resistance. If no one stood up to them, they'd keep pushing until they destroyed whatever shred of dignity their victim had left. Jason glanced around the store one last time, taking in the sea of faces watching quietly from a distance. He saw hesitation, discomfort, and even pity, but not action. That's when he realized something important. Sometimes, all it took was one person to break the cycle. One person willing to step forward and say, "Enough." With that realization burning in his chest, Jason straightened up. He pushed his cart aside and began walking toward the commotion. Each step brought him closer to the group, his presence commanding attention without him saying a word. Shoppers paused mid-stride, turning their heads to watch as the tall, muscular man approached the scene. Even the bullies seemed to sense something was different. They stopped laughing, their smirks faltering slightly as they noticed Jason closing in. By the time he reached the checkout area, all eyes were on him. The atmosphere shifted instantly, charged with anticipation. Whatever happened next, Jason knew one thing for certain. These bullies wouldn't get away with treating an innocent family this way, not if he had anything to say about it. Jason's arrival at the scene felt like a sudden gust of wind cutting through the thick tension in the air. His presence was impossible to ignore, tall, broad-shouldered, and exuding an aura of quiet authority that demanded respect. As he stepped closer to the group, the bullies instinctively straightened up, their earlier bravado wavering under his steady gaze. Shoppers who had been watching from a distance leaned in slightly, curious to see what this stranger would do next. The young mother noticed him too. Her eyes flickered toward Jason, wide with surprise and maybe a hint of hope. She didn't know who he was or why he was approaching, but something about the way he carried himself made her feel less alone. For the first time since the confrontation began, she stopped shrinking into herself and stood a little taller, clutching her children protectively as she waited to see what would happen. Jason didn't rush. He moved deliberately, his steps slow and measured, as if giving everyone around him time to process his presence. When he finally reached the checkout area, he turned his attention directly to the woman. His voice was calm but firm when he spoke. "Is everything okay here?" he asked simply, his tone leaving no room for dismissal. The question wasn't just for her. It was also a signal to the bullies that someone was now paying attention. For a moment, there was silence. The lead bully, the burly man who had started the argument, recovered quickly from his initial surprise and sneered at Jason. "Who are you supposed to be?" He shot back, his voice laced with mockery. "Her bodyguard." Jason didn't flinch. Instead, he gave the man a long, unblinking stare, his expression unreadable. It was the kind of look that could make even the toughest opponents second-guess themselves. Then, without missing a beat, he responded, "Nope. Just someone who doesn't like cowards picking on families." The simplicity of his words hit hard. There was no theatrics, no raised voice, just pure, undeniable truth wrapped in a tone that brooked no argument. The other shoppers exchanged glances, some nodding subtly in agreement while others held their breath, waiting to see how the bullies would react. One of the men tried to laugh it off, nudging his friend as if to say, "This guy's got guts." But the laughter sounded forced, hollow. Another member of the group muttered something under his breath, though he avoided making eye contact with Jason altogether. It was clear they hadn't expected anyone to challenge them. Not like this. Meanwhile, the young mother finally found her voice. "Thank you," she whispered softly, her gratitude evident despite the chaos around her. Jason gave her a brief nod, acknowledging her words without drawing more attention to her plight. He knew she didn't need to be the center of this confrontation any longer. The focus needed to shift away from her and onto the real problem: the bullies. As the seconds ticked by, Jason took stock of the situation. These men were loud, obnoxious, and clearly enjoying the power they thought they had over the woman. But he could see cracks forming in their confidence already. They weren't used to being called out or faced with someone who refused to back down. That realization gave him an edge, one he intended to use carefully. He glanced at the growing crowd of onlookers, many of whom now seemed less passive and more invested in the outcome. Some were recording the scene on their phones, capturing every word and gesture. Others whispered encouragement to each other, emboldened by Jason's intervention. Even the cashiers behind the counters appeared less intimidated, exchanging nervous smiles as they watched the tables turn. Still, Jason remained cautious. He knew better than to underestimate people like this. They thrived on chaos and unpredictability. One wrong move could escalate things further, putting the mother and her children in even greater danger. So he kept his demeanor calm and composed, refusing to let anger dictate his actions. This wasn't about revenge or teaching anyone a lesson. It was about restoring balance and ensuring the family could leave safely. With that goal firmly in mind, Jason shifted his stance slightly, positioning himself between the bullies and the mother. It was a subtle move, almost imperceptible, but it sent a clear message. If they wanted to continue this, they'd have to go through him first. And judging by the uneasy looks on their faces, none of them were eager to take that step. Not yet, anyway. The standoff continued, the air thick with anticipation. Every eye in the store was trained on Jason, waiting to see what he would do next. Little did they know, his plan wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic speeches. Sometimes, all it took to diffuse a situation was showing up and letting the bullies know they weren't untouchable anymore. The tension in the grocery store was palpable, like a tightly wound spring ready to snap. Jason stood firmly between the bullies and the young mother, his imposing figure creating an invisible barrier that neither side could ignore. The lead bully, still trying to assert dominance, leaned forward slightly, sneering at Jason. "You really want to get involved in this?" he asked, his tone dripping with false bravado. "This ain't your business." Jason didn't blink. His voice remained steady, almost casual, as if he were discussing the weather rather than confronting a group of aggressive men. "Actually," he said, crossing his arms over his chest, "it became my business the moment you decided it was okay to gang up on a mom and her kids." His words were simple but carried undeniable weight, cutting through the noise of the confrontation like a knife. The crowd around them seemed to hold its breath, every shopper now fully invested in the unfolding drama. Some recorded the scene on their phones, capturing Jason's calm demeanor and the bully's growing unease. Others whispered among themselves, their earlier hesitation replaced by admiration for the stranger who had stepped in where no one else dared. One of the bullies, shorter but stockier than the leader, tried to laugh off Jason's comment. "Oh, come on, man," he said, shaking his head. "She's holding up the line. You seriously gonna defend someone cutting?" He gestured dramatically toward the checkout counter, as if the mere act of pointing would somehow validate his argument. But instead of intimidating Jason, the gesture only highlighted how desperate they were becoming. Jason tilted his head slightly, studying the man with a look that bordered on pity. "Funny thing about lines," he said dryly, his tone laced with sarcasm. "They usually work better when people aren't yelling at each other. And last I checked, using coupons doesn't make you public enemy number one." A few shoppers chuckled nervously at his remark, breaking the oppressive tension just enough to remind everyone that the bullies weren't invincible. Even the cashier behind the register cracked a small smile before quickly looking away. The lead bully noticed too, and it clearly irritated him. He took a step closer to Jason, attempting to reclaim control of the situation. "Listen, buddy," he growled, jabbing a finger in Jason's direction. "You don't know who you're messing with." If Jason felt intimidated, he didn't show it. Instead, he raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "And you don't know who you're messing with," he replied coolly. His response hung in the air, heavy with implication. For the first time since the confrontation began, the bullies hesitated. They glanced at each other, uncertainty creeping into their expressions. None of them had expected this level of resistance, or wit, from a complete stranger. Sensing their wavering confidence, Jason pressed his advantage without raising his voice. "Here's the deal," he continued, his tone firm but reasonable. "You've got two choices. You can either apologize to this woman and let her finish her shopping in peace, or we can keep going. And trust me, you won't like where that leads." He paused briefly, letting his words sink in. "Your call." The simplicity of his ultimatum caught everyone off guard, including the bullies. There was no theatrics, no threats of violence, just a straightforward choice presented with unwavering certainty. It was clear that Jason wasn't bluffing. He'd seen this kind of behavior before and knew exactly how to handle it. The lead bully opened his mouth to retort, but nothing came out. He faltered, glancing at his friends for support, but they avoided his gaze. One of them shifted uncomfortably, muttering something under his breath about not needing this kind of trouble. Another looked down at his shoes, suddenly fascinated by the floor tiles. Whatever bravado they'd started with was crumbling under Jason's unshakable composure. Meanwhile, the young mother watched silently, her grip on the shopping cart loosening slightly as she realized the tide was turning. Her children peeked out from behind her legs, their wide eyes reflecting both fear and curiosity. She wanted to say something, to thank Jason again, but she didn't dare interrupt. Instead, she focused on keeping her family close, drawing strength from the quiet assurance Jason projected. As the standoff stretched on, Jason maintained his position, refusing to back down even an inch. He didn't need to shout or threaten. His presence alone was enough to command respect. The bullies, on the other hand, were visibly struggling to maintain their facade. Their earlier aggression had fizzled into awkward silence, leaving them scrambling for a way out. Finally, the lead bully muttered something unintelligible and took a step back, signaling defeat. His friends followed suit, exchanging nervous glances as they slowly retreated. With the bullies retreating, the atmosphere in the grocery store began to shift. The tension that had gripped everyone just moments ago started to ease, replaced by a collective sigh of relief. Shoppers who had been frozen in place now moved again, some resuming their shopping while others lingered nearby, eager to see how things would wrap up. Jason turned his full attention to the young mother and her children, his demeanor softening but still radiating calm authority. "You okay?" he asked gently, his voice low enough not to draw unnecessary attention. The woman nodded quickly, though her hands were still trembling as she clutched the handle of her shopping cart. Her younger child peeked out from behind her leg, wiping tears from his cheeks with the back of his hand. The older girl stood closer to her mother now, clutching her arm tightly, her wide eyes darting between Jason and the retreating bullies. They didn't hurt us," the mother stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." She glanced at Jason, gratitude shining through her tear-filled eyes. "Thank you. Really, thank you." Jason gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You don't have to thank me," he said simply. "No one deserves to be treated like that, especially not in front of their kids." His words carried a quiet strength, reminding her, and everyone else watching, that standing up against cruelty wasn't extraordinary. It was simply the right thing to do. Still, Jason knew the situation wasn't entirely resolved yet. The bullies might have backed off for now, but they were still lurking somewhere in the store, muttering under their breath and casting angry glances in his direction. He kept one eye on them while focusing on helping the family finish their shopping. "Let's get you checked out," he suggested, gesturing toward the checkout counter. "I'll stick around until you're done, just to make sure everything goes smoothly." The mother hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure whether accepting his help was the right thing to do. But Jason's calm presence put her at ease, and she finally nodded. Together, they pushed the cart toward the register, where the cashier greeted them with a nervous but appreciative smile. Wordlessly, Jason positioned himself slightly behind the family, keeping watch over the store as the transaction began. As the items were scanned and bagged, whispers rippled through the crowd. Some shoppers openly praised Jason's actions, calling him brave and honorable. Others marveled at how he'd managed to defuse such a volatile situation without resorting to aggression. A few even approached him cautiously, thanking him for stepping in when no one else had. Jason accepted their gratitude graciously, but humbly, brushing off compliments with a simple shrug. Anyone would have done the same, he insisted, though deep down he knew that wasn't true. Meanwhile, the bullies continued to lurk on the fringes of the scene, their frustration evident. One of them muttered loudly about making a scene and causing trouble, clearly hoping someone would overhear and side with them. But instead of gaining sympathy, their complaints only earned more disapproving looks from other customers. It was clear that public opinion had shifted entirely in favor of the mother and Jason. At one point, the lead bully tried to approach the checkout area again, perhaps hoping to salvage some shred of dignity. But before he could say anything, Jason turned to face him, his expression unreadable but undeniably intimidating. The man froze mid-step, his bravado crumbling under Jason's steady gaze. After a tense beat, he muttered something inaudible and slunk away, joining his friends near the exit. They huddled together, glaring daggers but too embarrassed to try anything further. By the time the groceries were paid for and bagged, the store felt almost normal again. The cashiers worked efficiently, shoppers resumed their routines, and the earlier chaos seemed like a distant memory. Jason helped the mother load her bags into her cart, ensuring everything was secure before handing her the receipt. "There you go," he said warmly. "All set." She looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes once more. But this time, they were tears of gratitude rather than fear. "I can't tell you how much this means to me," she said softly, her voice choked with emotion. "People like you. You remind me there's still good in the world." Jason chuckled lightly, scratching the back of his neck in an uncharacteristic display of modesty. "Like I said, anyone would have done it," he replied. "Just promise me one thing. Don't let jerks like that ruin your day. You've got two amazing kids who need you to keep being strong for them." The woman smiled faintly, nodding as she wiped her eyes. "I will," she promised. "And thank you again for everything." As the young mother drove away, waving one last time in gratitude, Jason lingered for a moment in the parking lot. He watched her car disappear down the street, ensuring she was truly safe before turning back toward the grocery store. The confrontation may have ended, but he knew the bullies were still inside, and their egos were bruised. If there was one thing Jason had learned over the years, it was that wounded pride often led to reckless behavior. He wasn't about to let them cause any more trouble. When he re-entered the store, the atmosphere had shifted noticeably. Customers who had witnessed the earlier drama now greeted him with nods of respect or quiet smiles. Some even stopped him to shake his hand, thanking him for stepping in when no one else would. "You really showed them," one elderly man said, clapping him on the shoulder. "We needed someone like you today." Jason accepted the praise graciously, though he remained focused. His sharp eyes scanned the aisles, searching for any sign of the bullies. Sure enough, he spotted them near the exit, huddled together and muttering furiously. Their body language screamed frustration. They were angry, humiliated, and itching for a way to reclaim some semblance of control. One of them noticed Jason watching and immediately nudged the others, pointing in his direction. The lead bully stepped forward, his face flushed with rage. "You think you're some kind of hero?" He spat, his voice loud enough to draw attention from nearby shoppers. "What gives you the right to stick your nose where it doesn't belong?" Jason didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step closer, his movements calm but purposeful. He stopped just far enough away to avoid escalating things physically, but close enough to make his presence felt. "I don't need a right," he said evenly, meeting the man's gaze without flinching. "All I needed was to see what was happening and decide whether to do something about it." Turns out, doing nothing wasn't an option. His words struck a nerve. The bully clenched his fists, visibly struggling to keep his temper in check. For a brief moment, it looked like he might lunge at Jason, but then one of his friends grabbed his arm, whispering urgently, "Dude, don't. Just let it go." The tension between them was palpable, a volatile mix of anger and fear simmering just beneath the surface. But the lead bully wasn't ready to back down completely. Frustrated and desperate to save face, he shoved Jason lightly in the chest, clearly trying to provoke a reaction. "You want to fight, tough guy?" he sneered, his voice dripping with false bravado. "Come on, show us what you've got." For most people, being pushed, even lightly, might have triggered an immediate response. But Jason wasn't most people. Years of martial arts training and real-world experience had taught him how to stay calm under pressure. Instead of retaliating, he reacted instantly, using the bully's momentum against him. With lightning-fast reflexes, Jason caught the man's wrist mid-push, twisting it gently but firmly until the bully froze in place. "Here's the thing," Jason said quietly, leaning in so only the bully could hear. "If you wanted to pick a fight, you picked the wrong person. You're mad. I get it. But taking that anger out on innocent people, or me, isn't gonna fix anything. Walk away while you still can." The bully's face turned pale as he realized he was completely outmatched. Jason's grip wasn't painful, but it was firm enough to make it clear he could escalate things if he chose to. More importantly, the look in Jason's eyes left no room for doubt. This wasn't a bluff. After a tense moment, the bully yanked his arm free, stumbling backward as his friends rushed to his side. "You're crazy," he muttered, glaring at Jason but making no move to approach again. "This isn't over." "It is for me," Jason replied simply, his tone final. "Go home. Cool off. And maybe next time, think twice before picking on someone who can't fight back." The group hesitated for a moment longer, their earlier arrogance replaced by uncertainty. Finally, they turned and walked out of the store, muttering angrily among themselves. As the door swung shut behind them, the remaining customers erupted into applause. Cashiers cheered, shoppers clapped, and a few even whistled in approval. Jason raised a hand to acknowledge the support, but quickly waved it off, signaling that the attention wasn't necessary. With the bullies gone and the situation resolved, Jason exhaled slowly, allowing himself a brief moment of relief. He hadn't thrown a single punch or raised his voice above a conversational level, yet he'd managed to diffuse a potentially dangerous confrontation. Sometimes, strength wasn't about physical force. It was about knowing when to act and when to hold back. And today, he'd done both perfectly. The applause from the shoppers echoed through the grocery store, but Jason didn't linger to soak it in. He gave a polite nod to those who were still clapping and quietly slipped away, heading back toward the aisles where he'd left his own shopping cart earlier. The commotion had disrupted his errands, but that was fine. He wasn't here for recognition or praise. As far as he was concerned, the day's work was done. The family was safe, the bullies had been neutralized, and life at the store could return to normal. Still, as Jason resumed pushing his cart down the aisles, he couldn't help but notice how the mood of the entire store had shifted. Shoppers who had previously avoided eye contact now smiled warmly as they passed him. Some even went out of their way to thank him again, calling him a real-life hero, or simply saying, "What you did, it meant something." One elderly woman stopped him near the produce section, her hands trembling slightly as she reached out to touch his arm. "You reminded us what kindness looks like," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "Don't ever lose sight of that." Jason smiled faintly, brushing off the compliments with characteristic humility. "I just did what anyone should have," he replied, though deep down, he knew not everyone would have stepped up. It wasn't about being extraordinary. It was about doing the right thing when it mattered most. And today, it had mattered. As he finished gathering the last few items on his list, Jason noticed a young cashier watching him intently from behind her register. She looked nervous but determined, clutching a piece of paper in her hand. When he approached her line to check out, she hesitated for a moment before finally speaking up. Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Could I maybe get a picture with you? For my mom. She loves your movies." Jason chuckled lightly, shaking his head in amusement. "Sure thing," he said, stepping aside so she could snap a quick photo with her phone. "But let's make one thing clear. I'm not really the star of this story. That mom and her kids are the ones who deserve all the attention." The cashier nodded eagerly, clearly thrilled despite his modesty. "Still, you're amazing," she said, blushing as she handed him his receipt. "Thank you for everything." By the time Jason left the store, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the parking lot. He loaded his groceries into his car, glancing around one last time to ensure everything was calm. Satisfied that the situation was truly resolved, he climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. But even as he drove home, his mind kept replaying the events of the afternoon, the fear in the mother's eyes, the cruelty of the bullies, and the way the crowd had rallied once someone finally stood up. Back at the store, word of Jason's actions spread quickly. Several customers posted videos online, capturing snippets of the confrontation and tagging them with phrases like #RealLifeHero and #StandingUpForOthers. Within hours, the story gained traction on social media, sparking conversations about courage, empathy, and the importance of standing up against bullying. People praised Jason not just for his bravery but for his restraint. He hadn't needed to resort to violence to resolve the situation. His calm demeanor and unwavering moral compass had spoken louder than any physical altercation ever could. For the young mother and her children, the impact was even more profound. That evening, as they unpacked their groceries at home, the woman found herself reflecting on what had happened. Her kids chattered excitedly about the superhero who had helped them, their earlier fear replaced by awe and admiration. She sat quietly at the kitchen table, staring at the receipt Jason had handed her after loading her bags into her cart. On the back, he'd scribbled a short note. "Stay strong. You're doing great." Tears welled in her eyes as she read the words over and over again. In that moment, she realized something important. She wasn't alone. There were still good people in the world, people willing to step in when others felt too afraid or indifferent to act. Jason's intervention hadn't just saved her from humiliation, it had restored her faith in humanity. Meanwhile, Jason returned to his quiet routine, putting the incident behind him as easily as he put away his groceries. To him, it wasn't a big deal. It was just another example of standing up for what was right. But unbeknownst to him, his actions had already begun to ripple outward, inspiring countless strangers to reflect on their own choices and consider how they might respond if faced with similar situations. Sometimes, the smallest acts of courage could spark the biggest changes. And today, Jason Statham had proven exactly that. By the time Jason settled into his evening routine, the story of his actions at the grocery store had already taken on a life of its own. Social media platforms buzzed with posts about the real-life hero who had stood up to bullies and defended a single mother and her children. Videos captured by shoppers showed snippets of the confrontation. Jason's calm demeanor, the bully's faltering confidence, and the crowd's growing support for the woman. Comments poured in from all over the world, praising not just his bravery, but his restraint and humility. Strangers shared personal stories of times they'd witnessed or experienced bullying, expressing gratitude that someone like Jason existed to remind them there was still good in the world. For Jason, however, life went on as usual. He didn't check social media often, preferring to stay grounded in his day-to-day activities rather than chase fame or recognition. When a friend called later that night to tell him the video had gone viral, he simply shrugged it off. "It's not about me," he said, leaning back in his chair with a sigh. "I just did what needed to be done. That mom and her kids are the real story." But even as he downplayed his role, others refused to let it go unnoticed. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as an inspiring example of everyday heroism. Reporters reached out to the grocery store, interviewing cashiers and customers who had been present during the incident. The young mother, overwhelmed by the sudden attention, agreed to speak briefly about how much Jason's intervention had meant to her family. "He didn't have to step in," she told one reporter, her voice trembling with emotion. "But he did, and it changed everything for us. We won't forget that kindness." As the days passed, the ripple effects of Jason's actions continued to spread. Schools began sharing the story with students, using it as a lesson in standing up against bullying and treating others with compassion. Community groups discussed ways they could foster similar acts of courage and empathy in their neighborhoods. Even celebrities chimed in, applauding Jason for embodying the values of integrity and strength both on screen and off. Memes featuring his iconic tough guy persona alongside captions like, "Not today," bullies popped up across the internet, blending humor with admiration. Despite the growing spotlight, Jason remained unfazed. He declined interviews and politely asked reporters to focus on more important issues. "I'm no different than anyone else," he said when pressed for comment. "If you see someone being treated unfairly, step in. It doesn't take a superhero. It takes a person willing to care." His words resonated deeply, reminding people that true heroism wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic flair. It was about doing the right thing quietly and without expecting anything in return. Back at the grocery store, things slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as they could be after such an extraordinary event. Employees joked about making Jason an honorary team member, while regular customers reminisced about the day a Hollywood star became their local hero. Some even started referring to the checkout area where the confrontation had occurred as Jason's Lane, turning it into a lighthearted piece of store lore. For the young mother, life felt a little brighter too. Encouraged by the outpouring of support, she decided to pay Jason's kindness forward. She volunteered at a nearby community center, helping organize programs for struggling families. Her children, inspired by the man who had stood up for them, began standing up for classmates who were teased or excluded at school. In their own small ways, they carried the spirit of Jason's actions into the world, proving that even the simplest acts of courage could inspire lasting change. In the end, Jason Statham's trip to the grocery store became more than just a random act of kindness. It became a reminder of the power of empathy and action. Heroes weren't defined by capes or cameras. They were ordinary people who chose to make a difference when it mattered most. And though Jason would likely never seek the title, those who knew his story understood the truth. Sometimes, the greatest heroes were the ones who didn't think twice before stepping into hell. Life moved on, as it always did, but the memory of that afternoon stayed etched in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed it, a testament to the fact that even in the most unexpected places, goodness could shine through.